The last thing she saw before the darkness was a single white magnolia blossom, its petals like porcelain against the bruised twilight sky. It tumbled into the pine box, landing softly beside her cheek. A gesture so tender, so poetic. It made the act itself 1,000 times more monstrous. Then came the first shovelful of Georgia red clay, thudding against the lid with the finality of a closing casket, and then another and another. The world, her world, was reduced to the smell of pine, damp earth, and the echo of her own silent scream. Marcus Thorne, the man who had placed the magnolia, worked with a grim, rhythmic efficiency. His shoulders, the same ones Alani Washington had clung to just last night, now strained with the effort of burying her alive. Beside him, his best friend, Leo Simmons, shoveled with a manic energy, his breath fogging in the humid Georgia air. "Deeper," Leo grunted, his voice a low rasp. "Can't have some hunter's dog sniffing her out." Marcus didn't answer. His mind was a maelstrom, flashing back to the day he'd first seen her. It was at a fundraiser for the Augusta University Medical Center, where Alani was a rising star in the nursing program. She stood in a circle of older white doctors, her posture perfect, her smile bright but guarded. She was navigating a world that constantly tested her, and Marcus saw it instantly. He'd approached her, a life raft of easy charm in a sea of condescending smiles. He'd defended her when a senior physician had patronizingly called her articulate, as if it were a surprise. He'd made her laugh, a genuine, unguarded sound that made his chest ache. "You're a fighter, Alani Washington," he had whispered to her on their third date, his lips against her ear. "And I'll always be in your corner." She'd believed him. She, a woman who had fought for every scrap of respect in her life, who had studied twice as hard to be considered half as good, had finally found someone who saw her strength, not just her skin color. He was her ally, her partner, the man who held her when the microaggressions of the day wore her down, the man who promised her a future where she wouldn't have to fight so hard. Now, that same man was trying to erase her from existence. The memory of his promise was a bitter acid in her throat. The box was cheap, unfinished pine, the kind used for shipping, not for eternal rest. It was small, pressing in on her from all sides, a brutal mockery of a womb. She could feel the splinters against her skin through her thin cotton dress. Panic, cold and sharp, began to crawl up her limbs. "Breathe, Alani, breathe. You're a nurse. You know the science? Panic burns oxygen." She forced her lungs to slow, to draw in the stale, metallic-tasting air. He'd hit her, in their kitchen, during the argument. Her head had struck the corner of the granite countertop. The world had gone star-spangled, then black. She hadn't felt a pulse. He must have assumed she was dead. He didn't even check. He didn't care enough to make sure. That thought, more than the claustrophobia, fueled a flicker of rage in the cold terror. It was a tiny spark, but in the absolute darkness of her premature grave, it was enough to see by. Above her, the shoveling stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, more suffocating than the tons of earth pressing down. "Is it done?" Marcus's voice was hollow, a ghost's whisper. "It's done," Leo confirmed, his voice laced with a satisfaction that made Alani's blood run cold. "She's gone. Problem solved. Now, let's go get paid." There was the sound of retreating footsteps, the crunch of leaves and twigs, and then nothing. Only the immense, crushing weight of the earth and the chilling silence of the forest. He'd left her. He'd buried his vow to her, his love for her, beneath a mountain of dirt and lies. He'd left her to die in a cheap wooden box, with only a single beautiful magnolia for company. It was a poetic end to a love story that had been alive from the very beginning. But as Alani lay there, her mind racing, she made a new vow. This wasn't an ending. It was an awakening. The ground above her wasn't a tombstone. It was a starting line. This was never about a wedding. The white dress, the tiered cake, the honeymoon in Savannah, those were just the sugar coating on a rotten core. The real story, the one that led to a pine box in the woods, began with the sour smell of stale beer and desperation at a back alley poker game. Marcus Thorne was a man drowning, and Leo Simmons was the one holding his head underwater. Leo worked at the Simmons & Sons funeral home, a family business that had seen better days. But Leo's real business happened after hours. He wasn't just an undertaker, he was a bottom feeder, a connoisseur of human weakness. And Marcus, with his expensive tastes and perpetually empty wallet, was his prize catch. Marcus owed him over $30,000, a gambling debt that had grown like a tumor, threatening to consume what little he had. 2 weeks ago, in Leo's embalming room, a sterile, cold space that smelled of formaldehyde and failure, the plan was born. "You're looking at it all wrong, man," Leo said, polishing a stainless steel instrument. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly green pallor on his face. "You're not in a hole. You're on the ground floor of an opportunity." "Opportunity?" Marcus scoffed, pacing between a gurney and a rack of fluid bottles. "I'm about to lose my car, Leo. Alani's starting to ask questions about our savings." Leo stopped polishing and looked at Marcus, his eyes small and shrewd. "Your girl, Alani, the smart nurse, the one with the keys to the kingdom." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know what the real gold rush is right now? It ain't crypto. It ain't tech stocks. It's fentanyl. Specifically, those high-dose patches they give to cancer patients." Marcus froze. "What are you talking about? Stealing from the hospital?" "We're not stealing," Leo corrected him smoothly, a semantic game he loved to play. "We're reallocating resources. Look, I know people. Serious people from Atlanta who will pay top dollar for that stuff. No questions asked. A single box of those patches, the 100 microgram ones, that's 50 grand on the street. Your debt's gone, and we both walk away with a nice little nest egg." The plan was as simple as it was evil. Alani's ID badge was a high-level one, giving her after-hours access to the hospital's central pharmacy. All Marcus had to do was borrow it, slip in late at night, and grab a specific package from a specific shelf. Leo had inside information from a disgruntled pharmacy tech he was blackmailing. It was, he promised, foolproof. But Marcus hesitated. Alani would never. If she found out, it would destroy her. Her career, everything she's worked for. This was the moment Leo had been waiting for. He put down the instrument and walked over to Marcus, placing a hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture that mimicked friendship, but felt like a manacle. "Let me ask you something, Marcus," he said, his voice soft and venomous. "You ever get tired of it? Of being the good one? The respectable black man who's still driving a 5-year-old sedan while your white buddies from college are buying lake houses? You're with this brilliant, ambitious woman, and you can't even afford the ring she deserves without going into debt." He was poking at the rawest nerve, the deep-seated insecurity that Marcus hid beneath his charm, the feeling that he was always playing catch-up, that the American dream was a party he could hear but was never invited to. "You think Alani doesn't see it?" Leo pressed on, twisting the knife. "She loves you now, but women like her, they're going places. They don't stick with men who can't keep up. This isn't just about the money, Marcus. This is about respect. It's about taking what you're owed. You do this, you pay me off, you give her the wedding of her dreams, and you become the man you're supposed to be, the man she needs you to be." He made it sound like an act of love, an ugly, desperate act, reframed as noble sacrifice. Marcus looked around the cold, sterile room, at the tools designed to prepare the dead, and saw a way out. He saw a future where the anxiety in his chest was replaced by the crisp feel of $100 bills. He saw Alani looking at him, not with concern, but with pride. "She'll never find out," Leo assured him, sealing the deal. "One quick trip, in and out. We split it 60-40. You get the bigger cut, clear your debt, and have cash to spare." The thought of betraying Alani was a heavy stone in his gut. But the thought of failing, of being the man Leo had just described, was heavier. He was being offered a choice between his integrity and his pride. In the cold, quiet hum of the embalming room, surrounded by the machinery of death, Marcus Thorne made his decision. He chose pride. He chose the money, and in doing so, he chose the path that would lead him, just 2 weeks later, to a shallow grave in the Georgia woods. Alani Washington lived her life by the charts. As an ICU nurse, she believed in data, in patterns, in the subtle deviations that signaled a crisis long before the alarms went off. A patient's temperature rising by half a degree, a slight dip in oxygen saturation, a barely perceptible change in heart rhythm. These were the whispers of disaster, and she had started to hear those same whispers in her own life. It began in the hospital's controlled substance logbook, a box of high-potency fentanyl patches, logged out for a terminal patient in the oncology ward. But the patient had passed away the day before the log entry was made. A clerical error, she'd assumed, and made a note to follow up. Then it happened again, a week later. Another discrepancy, another box of the same medication unaccounted for. It was a tiny crack in the hospital's rigid system, one that most would overlook, but Alani's mind, trained to spot anomalies, snagged on it. At the same time, the perfect facade of her life with Marcus began to show its own cracks. He surprised her with a new iPhone, the latest model. "A little pre-wedding gift," he'd said, his smile as bright as the phone's screen. A week later, it was a pair of diamond earrings, small but elegant. "You work so hard, baby. You deserve to be spoiled." "Marcus, how can we afford this?" she asked, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. They were supposed to be saving every penny for the down payment on a small house. "I closed a big commission at work," he'd lied, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Don't worry about it. Just let me take care of you." But she did worry. The whispers were getting louder, the discrepancies at work, the lavish gifts at home. The two events were happening in concert, a dissonant harmony that set her teeth on edge. The final jarring note came on a Tuesday night. Marcus was in the shower, and his phone, the new one he'd bought her, buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Leo. Alani would never have looked, but the message preview flashed on the screen, stark and damning. "ATL contact is happy, wants another shipment ASAP. Same deal. Shipment." The word hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't a word a car salesman used. It was a word from a different, darker vocabulary. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The missing fentanyl, the sudden influx of cash. Leo's work at the funeral home, a place all too familiar with the end-of-life drugs she'd been tracking, and her ID badge, which had mysteriously gone missing from her purse for a few hours 2 separate times in the last month, only to reappear with a flimsy excuse from Marcus about it getting mixed up with his keys. When he came out of the bathroom, a towel around his waist, humming a tune, he found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale. His phone was in her hand. His smile faltered. "Hey, what's wrong?" "What shipment, Marcus?" she asked, her voice quiet but shaking with the force of her discovery. "What deal are you and Leo making?" The charming facade crumbled, replaced by a flash of panicked anger. He tried to gaslight her first, his go-to defense. "What are you talking about? You're going through my phone now? After everything I do for you, you don't trust me? Don't you dare turn this on me," she shot back, standing up. The fear was being replaced by a cold, righteous fury. "I've been seeing the logs at work. High-grade narcotics are disappearing, Marcus. And every time they do, you magically have money for diamonds. You've been using my ID badge, haven't you?" He stared at her, his mind racing for an escape route, but her accusation was too precise. He was cornered. So he attacked. "So what if I did?" he snarled, the confession ripping out of him. "I did it for us, to give you the life you deserve, so you wouldn't have to be ashamed of me." "Ashamed?" The word was a slap. "I was never ashamed of you, Marcus. I was proud of you. But this is monstrous. You didn't just steal, you stole in my name. You used me. You put my entire career, my entire future on the line. People could die from this. You could go to prison for years." "You don't get it," he yelled, advancing on her. "This was our way out. This is a cage," she said, her voice dropping, heavy with the weight of her shattered love. She backed away from him, her decision hardening with every word he spoke. "I'm going to my cousin Amani's tonight, and tomorrow morning, I'm going to my supervisor and the police. I'm going to tell them everything." That was his trigger. The threat of exposure, of the world seeing him not as the charming, successful man he pretended to be, but as the weak, desperate criminal he was. "No," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You're not going to tell anyone." He lunged for her, grabbing her arm. She tried to pull away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Let go of me, Marcus." Her scream was cut short. In his blind rage, he shoved her. It wasn't a calculated move, just a desperate, violent reaction. But it was enough. Her feet tangled, and she stumbled backward. The back of her head connected with the sharp, unforgiving edge of the granite countertop. A sickening crack echoed in the small kitchen, followed by an even more sickening silence. Alani's eyes rolled back, and her body crumpled to the floor, as limp and lifeless as a discarded doll. Marcus stared down at her, his chest heaving, the rage instantly evaporating, replaced by a tidal wave of pure, icy terror. He had not just crossed a line. He had obliterated it. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent, stabbing pain. It was a single piercing point in her left temple, a hot spike of agony that radiated through her skull. Then came the smells, damp, loamy earth, the sharp scent of pine resin, and the coppery tang of her own blood. Finally, the feeling of being compressed, contained, shrink-wrapped in rough, splintery wood. Her first thought was a clinical one. I'm dead. This is what it feels like. Her second, a rebellion of logic. No. The dead don't feel pain. The dead don't think. Panic, a primal animal terror, surged through her. She was in a box, a coffin. He had buried her. The realization was a physical shock, a jolt of adrenaline so powerful it nearly made her pass out again. She screamed, a raw, desperate sound that was immediately choked and absorbed by the suffocating confines. The sound didn't even echo. It just died, a pathetic puff of air against the lid inches from her face. Breathe, Alani, breathe. The voice in her head was her own, but it was also the voice of every instructor she'd ever had. Control your respiration. Conserve oxygen. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford. She forced air into her lungs, slowly, deliberately, fighting the instinct to hyperventilate. She was a nurse. She understood the human body's limits. She knew that in this enclosed space, oxygen was her most precious and most finite resource. She had to think. She had to make a plan. First, assessment. She moved her fingers, then her hands. They responded, her arms, her legs, stiff, aching, but they moved. She wasn't paralyzed. She ran her hands over her prison. Wood, rough, unfinished planks. She could feel the gaps between them, tiny fissures that were letting in a trickle of air. That's why she wasn't dead yet. The box was cheap, poorly constructed, a fatal flaw in his murderous plan, a flaw that might just be her salvation. Through one of the larger cracks near her head, she could see a faint, diffused light. It was daytime. How long had she been here? Hours? A whole day? There was no way to know. Next, action. She tried to push against the lid with her hands. It didn't budge. She pressed harder, putting the strength of her back and legs into it, her muscles screaming in protest. Nothing. The weight on top was immense, unyielding. Earth. Wet. Heavy. Georgia clay. He buried me. The thought returned, this time not with panic, but with a surge of pure, crystalline rage. Rage at Marcus for his betrayal. Rage at Leo for his poison. Rage at herself for not seeing the cracks sooner. The rage was fuel. It burned away the terror, leaving a cold, hard determination in its place. She changed her tactic. Instead of a broad push, she focused all her energy on one spot, driving her palms against a single plank near the center of the lid. She pushed again and again, a desperate rhythmic assault. The wood groaned in protest. She felt a slight give, a tiny flex. It was enough. She kept pushing, her breath coming in controlled gasps. Sweat beaded on her forehead and ran into her eyes, stinging. Her shoulders ached with an agony she had never known. Then she heard it, a sound more beautiful than any symphony, a sharp crack. One of the boards had split. A shower of dirt rained down on her face, gritty and cold. She didn't care. She had a breach. She pushed her fingers through the new opening, clawing at the soil above. It was wet and loose from the recent rain. Her nails bent and broke against unseen rocks, but she barely felt the pain. Her entire existence had narrowed to this single, desperate task, digging up. It was a slow, torturous process. Handful by handful, she pulled the dirt into the box, the cramped space filling with the earth that was meant to be her tomb. It was claustrophobic, terrifying work. The dirt piled up around her neck and chest, but she kept going, widening the hole, pulling herself upward through the soil. It felt like a perverse, horrifying rebirth. After what felt like an eternity, Hours of clawing, scraping, and pushing, her hand broke through the surface. She felt the cool, open air on her skin. She gasped, a ragged, desperate sob of triumph. She wasn't free yet, but she could breathe. With a final, monumental effort, she pulled her head and shoulders out of the ground. The world spun, a dizzying kaleidoscope of green and brown. She collapsed onto the damp leaves beside her makeshift grave, her lungs burning as they greedily gulped down the fresh, pine-scented air. She lay there for a long time, her body trembling, her mind a blank slate of shock and exhaustion. She had done it. She had clawed her way out of her own grave. She was alive. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new chilling question crept in. What now? The first instinct was to run, to sprint through the woods, find a road, flag down a car, and get to the nearest police station, to show them her bruised face, her torn clothes, the dirt under her broken fingernails, and tell them the monster's name, Marcus Thorne. But as she staggered to her feet, leaning against a towering pine for support, a cold, hard piece of wisdom settled over her. It was a lesson her father had drilled into her since she was a little girl growing up in the Deep South. "Alani," he used to say, his voice a low, sad rumble. "In this world, especially down here, being right isn't always enough. For a black woman, your truth has to be louder, brighter, and more undeniable than anyone else's, or they won't even bother to listen. If she went to the police now, what would happen? She was a hysterical woman, covered in dirt, making a wild accusation against her handsome, charming fiancé. Marcus would be calm. He would be concerned. He'd tell them they had a terrible fight, that she'd stormed out. He'd say she was unstable, prone to drama. The bruises? She probably fell in the woods after running off. It would be her word, the word of a frantic, traumatized black woman against his. The word of a composed, believable black man. In the calculus of justice in Augusta, Georgia, she knew how that equation often worked out. They would give him the benefit of the doubt. They might file a domestic violence report, issue a temporary restraining order, and send her to a shelter. But they wouldn't see attempted murder. They wouldn't see the cold, calculated plot. They wouldn't find the grave without her to lead them there, and even then, he would deny it all. He would walk, and he would know she was alive. And a man who tries to bury you once will not hesitate to finish the job. No, she couldn't be a victim. She had to be a ghost with a purpose. There was only one person she could trust, not just to believe her, but to understand the twisted game she now had to play. Her younger cousin, Imani Washington. Imani was everything Alani wasn't. While Alani was measured and methodical, Imani was a firecracker. A third-year law student at Emory in Atlanta, she was sharp-tongued, fiercely intelligent, and possessed a healthy cynicism about the justice system she was about to enter. It took Alani hours to make her way out of the woods and limp the several miles to a secluded bus stop. She hid in the shadows, a specter of dirt and dried blood, until a late-night bus heading towards Atlanta rumbled into view. She paid the fare with the crumpled $20 bill she still had in her pocket, ignoring the driver's wary stare. Every mile the bus traveled away from Augusta was a mile closer to her only hope. She showed up on Imani's doorstep in Decatur just before dawn. Imani opened the door, her sleepy expression instantly transforming into one of pure shock and horror. "Oh my God! Alani, what happened to you?" "Let me in," Alani rasped, her voice raw. "And don't call anyone. Don't text anyone. As of right now, I don't exist." Inside the small, book-filled apartment, over a cup of steaming tea that Alani's trembling hands could barely hold, the story poured out of her. The stolen drugs, the confrontation, the blow to her head, the wooden box, the magnolia, the desperate escape. Imani listened, her face hardening from compassionate concern into a cold, legal fury. When Alani finished, Imani didn't offer platitudes or hugs. She walked to her desk, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and uncapped a pen. "Okay," Imani said, her voice devoid of emotion, all business. "He thinks you're dead. That's our single biggest advantage. Your father was right. Going to the cops now is a coin toss, and your life isn't worth that risk. A DA might not even take the case. It's a he said, she said with no weapon, no witnesses, and a pre-existing domestic dispute. They'll bury it. The irony of her cousin's word choice was not lost on Alani. "So, what do we do?" Alani whispered. Imani looked up from her pad, and for the first time, Alani saw the fire in her eyes. It was the same fire she felt in her own gut. "We do their job for them," Imani declared. "We build a case so airtight, so undeniable, that when you finally walk back into his life, it's not to a police station, but to a courtroom. We're not just seeking justice, Alani. We're going to orchestrate it. We need proof of the drug theft. We need proof of his connection to Leo. We need proof he was at that location. We need to tie it all together in a neat little bow. He wanted to bury you? Fine. We're going to bury him under a mountain of evidence." For the first time since waking up in that box, Alani felt a flicker of something other than fear or rage. It was hope, a dangerous, sharp-edged hope. She looked at her cousin, the law books lining the walls behind her like an arsenal. She had survived the grave. Now, with Imani in her corner, she was ready to go to war. The ghost had found her ally. Detective Frank Harding of the Augusta Richmond County Sheriff's Office was a man running on fumes. With 3 years until retirement, his desk was a monument to unsolved cases and bureaucratic paperwork. He was a relic from another era of policing, a time before body cams and digital forensics, when a case was solved by shoe leather, gut feelings, and knowing the right people to lean on. He was tired, cynical, and had seen too many grieving families to have much faith left in the world. So, when a sharp, well-dressed young law student named Imani Washington walked into his precinct to file a missing persons report for her cousin, Alani Washington, his first reaction was a weary sigh. He listened patiently in his cramped, cluttered office as Imani laid out the official story they had concocted. Alani had a big fight with her fiancé, Marcus Thorne. She'd told Imani she was leaving him and coming to Atlanta, but she never arrived. Her fiancé, Mr. Thorne, he claimed she just packed a bag and left, Imani said, her voice carefully controlled, betraying no hint of the horrifying truth. But Alani wouldn't do that. Not without her car, her laptop, her medication. She's a creature of habit, detective. Something is wrong. Harding had heard variations of this story 100 times. A young couple fights, one leaves to cool off. They usually turn up in a day or two, embarrassed and apologetic. His captain, a younger man with political ambitions and a focus on stats, would want this filed as a simple, voluntary departure and closed by the end of the week, especially given the demographics. In his captain's unspoken view, another case of drama in the black community wasn't a priority. Harding drove over to the apartment Alani shared with Marcus. He found Marcus there, looking the part of the distraught fiancé perfectly. He was worried, his brow furrowed, his answers smooth and plausible. "We just argued, detective," Marcus said, his voice thick with rehearsed emotion. "About the wedding, the money. Stupid stuff. She got so angry, said she needed space, that she was going to her cousin's. I tried to stop her, but you know how it is. I feel terrible. I should have gone after her." It was all very convincing, but Harding, with his 30 years of reading people, saw something else. He saw the flicker of something in Marcus's eyes that wasn't grief. It was relief. And behind the relief, a deep, gnawing anxiety. The man was performing, and Harding was a critic who'd seen it all. He also noticed that for a man whose fiancée had just walked out, the apartment was remarkably tidy. Too tidy. It felt sterile, scrubbed clean. Back at the precinct, he ran Marcus Thorne's name. Clean record. He called the hospital where Alani worked. Her supervisor confirmed she was a model employee, reliable to a fault. She hadn't called in sick. She had just vanished. "Let it go, Frank," his captain, Lalitins Davies, told him later that day, glancing at the file. "She's 26 years old. She had a fight with her boyfriend. She'll turn up in Atlanta with a hangover. We've got 3 armed robberies and a homicide in the last 48 hours. That's where I need my detectives." "Something's not right about the fiancé," Harding insisted. "My gut tells me he's lying." "Your gut doesn't write reports or close cases," Davies retorted, his tone dismissive. "Unless you've got something more than a feeling, file it and move on." The subtle racism of the dismissal hung in the air. If Alani had been the daughter of a white doctor from the affluent west side of Augusta, there would be a task force, press conferences. But for a black nurse from a working-class family, she was just another file to be buried in a cabinet. Harding knew his captain was right about one thing. He had nothing. No evidence, no witnesses, nothing but a gut feeling and the earnest plea in Imani Washington's eyes. He officially filed the report as instructed, marking it as a low-priority voluntary missing person case. He slid the thin manila folder into the overflowing, pending tray on his desk. But he didn't move on. That night, after the precinct had emptied out, he sat alone under the hum of the fluorescent lights and pulled the file back out. He stared at the smiling picture of Alani Washington that Imani had provided. She had kind eyes, eyes that had seen a lot. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus Thorne's tidy apartment and his too-perfect performance. On a hunch, he pulled up the local cell tower data requests, a tedious process he usually avoided. He put in a request for all activity on Marcus Thorne's number for the night Alani disappeared. It was a long shot, a fishing expedition without a hook. He was a lone wolf, fighting against the indifference of his own department. He had no leads, no support, and a suspect who was, on the surface, a pillar of the community. But Frank Harding had one thing his captain didn't: time. He was close to the end of his career, with nothing left to lose, and he decided he was going to spend some of that time figuring out what really happened to Alani Washington. The file might be buried on his desk, but he wasn't going to let the case die with it. While Detective Harding was navigating the molasses-slow channels of official police work, a very different kind of investigation was unfolding in Imani's cramped Decatur apartment. It was an operation fueled by caffeine, rage, and the unique combination of Alani's medical knowledge and Imani's legal mind. Their war room was a coffee table littered with takeout containers, a laptop, and a large whiteboard covered in frantic scribbles. "We can't just look for a single transaction," Alani said, pointing a finger at the whiteboard. It was day 3 of her resurrection, and the initial shock was giving way to a laser-like focus. "A scheme like this needs a supply chain. Leo's contact at the hospital, the pharmacy tech, they would have to be falsifying records systematically. We need to find the pattern." She still had her hospital login credentials. It was a risk, but a necessary one. Late at night, using a VPN to mask her location, Alani logged into the hospital's pharmacy inventory system. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her medical training giving her an intimate understanding of the complex software. She wasn't looking for what was logged out. She was looking for what wasn't. "Here," she breathed, her eyes widening. "It's not just theft, it's a swap. They're replacing the high-dose fentanyl patches with expired, low-dose saline patches. The box counts are correct on a surface level, but the lot numbers and expiration dates are falsified. It's brilliant in a sick way. Only a detailed audit would catch it." She began building a spreadsheet, a meticulous record of every discrepancy. Dates, times, lot numbers, and the name of the pharmacy tech who signed off on the inventory checks, a man named Gary Miller. A quick social media search by Imani revealed Gary Miller's profile, full of pictures of a new motorcycle and expensive fishing gear, purchases far beyond the salary of a pharmacy tech. "That's our inside man," Imani said, circling his name in red marker on the whiteboard. "Now, let's connect him to Leo." Imani took over, her legal training kicking in. She dove into public records, online databases, and the gray areas of the internet that law students were so good at navigating. While Alani tracked the flow of stolen medicine, Imani tracked the flow of money and association. She discovered that Leo Simmons didn't just work at the family funeral home. He was the sole proprietor of a shell LLC called Southern Heritage Logistics. It had no website, no physical address other than a P.O. box, and had received a series of large, unexplained cash deposits over the last 6 months. "Logistics," Imani muttered, tapping her pen against her teeth. "A fancy word for moving things. And look at this." She pointed to the screen. "Leo and Gary Miller went to the same high school. They're connected on social media, old friends." The web was taking shape. Gary stole the drugs, falsifying the records. Leo, through his logistics company, moved them. And Marcus? Marcus was the weak link, the desperate fool they used for his access to Alani. "But this isn't enough," Alani said, her voice tight with frustration. "This proves a drug theft ring. It doesn't prove Marcus tried to murder me. We need to place him in those woods." That was the wall they kept hitting. There was no physical evidence tying Marcus to that patch of dirt. no witnesses. It was a ghost's word against a charming man's denial. Then we have to make him lead us there, Imani said, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous idea. He thinks you're dead. He and Leo think they got away with it. They're going to get sloppy. They're going to talk. Imani explained her plan. It was audacious and legally dubious. They would use a burner phone to send an anonymous, cryptic text to Marcus, something to rattle his cage. Not a threat, but a hint that someone knew. Something like, "The magnolias are wilting in the woods." "It's a bluff," Imani explained. "We're creating a stimulus to provoke a response. He'll get paranoid. He'll call Leo. And we need to be listening when he does." Alani's heart pounded. This was moving from investigation to entrapment. "How can we listen?" "Marcus is an idiot about technology," Alani suddenly remembered, a key detail surfacing from the fog of her memory. He was always complaining about his phone's storage. He bought extra cloud storage and set everything, photos, contacts, even his call logs, to back up automatically. He bragged that he'd never lose anything. Imani's face broke into a grim smile. "And you know his password, don't you?" Alani nodded slowly. It was the date of their first-year anniversary, a date that now felt like a lifetime ago. The two parallel investigations were worlds apart. One, official and hamstrung by procedure, was slowly sifting through data, looking for a needle in a haystack. The other, unofficial and operating in the shadows, was about to light the entire haystack on fire. Detective Harding's request for Marcus Thorne's cell data came back, and it was exactly what he expected. Inconclusive. Marcus had been near his apartment the night Alani disappeared. He'd made one call to Leo Simmons around midnight. When questioned, Marcus had a ready answer. "I was freaking out. Leo's my best friend. I called him for support." It was a perfect dead end. Harding was at a standstill, the thin file on Alani Washington mocking him from the corner of his desk. He was ready to admit defeat when Imani Washington walked back into his office, her expression more intense than before. "I've been thinking, Detective," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "Marcus is an avid hunter. He has a favorite spot he always goes to, deep in the Finney Swamp Nature Park, off the main trails. He calls it his thinking spot." It was a lie, a piece of bait carefully crafted by her and Alani. They had researched Marcus's digital footprint, finding a geotagged photo he'd posted years ago from that general area. It was a long shot, but it was all they had to give Harding a push in the right direction. "A thinking spot?" Harding raised a skeptical eyebrow. "He goes there to clear his head," Imani pressed. "If he did something, if he was panicking, it's a place he might go." It was thin, but it was more than Harding had. Finney Swamp was a vast, sprawling wilderness of wetlands and dense forest. Searching it would be a nightmare. He'd need a team, and more importantly, he'd need something his captain hated to authorize for a low-priority case. The K-9 unit. It took all of Harding's waning political capital, but he managed to persuade Lieutenant Davies. "One day, Frank," Davies warned him. "You get one day with the dog. If you don't find anything, this case goes cold, for good." The next morning, Harding stood at the edge of the swamp, the air thick with the smell of decay and life. With him were two uniformed officers and Officer Miller with his K-9 partner, Zeus, a magnificent German shepherd whose intelligent eyes missed nothing. "What are we looking for, Detective?" Miller asked as Zeus strained at the leash, eager to work. "A grave," Harding said bluntly. The uniforms exchanged a look. They thought the old man had finally lost it. They started with the area near the old geotagged photo. For hours they swept through the dense undergrowth, the humidity oppressive. Zeus worked diligently, his nose to the ground, but found nothing more than raccoon tracks and deer droppings. The sun climbed higher, and the morale of the team sank with every fruitless yard they covered. Davies's warning echoed in Harding's mind. His one shot was evaporating in the Georgia heat. "Maybe the girl was right and he just came here to think," one of the uniforms muttered, swatting at a mosquito. Harding was about to call it a day when Zeus suddenly froze. The dog's ears perked up, his body went rigid, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. He was locked onto a small clearing 100 yards away, an area they hadn't covered yet. "What is it, boy?" Miller said, his voice tense. Zeus led them forward, pulling hard. As they got closer, Harding saw it. a patch of ground where the leaves and pine straw seemed unnaturally disturbed. His heart began to pound. This was it. But as Zeus reached the edge of the disturbed earth, he whined, shaking his head and backing away. He sneezed violently, then sneezed again. "What the hell?" Miller said, kneeling beside his dog. He sniffed the air. "Ammonia. Smells like someone poured a whole bottle of industrial cleaner here." Harding's heart sank. It was a classic, brutal tactic to destroy any scent and throw a dog off. The perpetrators were smart. They had covered their tracks. He saw the "I told you so" look already forming on his captain's face. It was over. He knelt, running his hand over the packed earth. It was a grave. He knew it in his bones. But without the dog's official alert, he had no probable cause to get a warrant to excavate. They were standing on top of the crime scene, and his hands were tied. Dejected, he stood up to call off the search. But Zeus, having recovered from the ammonia, wasn't giving up. He was no longer focused on the grave. He was now sniffing intently at the base of a large oak tree a few feet away, pawing at the roots. "What have you got now, Z?" Miller asked, his curiosity piqued. Zeus nudged something with his nose, then looked back at Miller and barked once, a sharp, clear sound. Harding and Miller moved in. There, tangled in the gnarled roots of the old oak, half hidden by a clump of moss, was a small, metallic object. Harding knelt, pulling an evidence bag from his pocket. Using a pair of tweezers, he carefully picked it up. It was a single silver bobby pin, twisted and bent, with a few strands of dark curly hair caught in its clasp. It was insignificant. It was meaningless. It was everything. It was the one small, desperate thing they hadn't counted on. It was the first piece of physical evidence that proved Alani Washington, or at least a part of her, had been right here, in this remote, God-forsaken patch of woods. Harding looked at the bobby pin glinting in the palm of his gloved hand. It wasn't a warrant, but it was a start. It was a scent of justice that not even ammonia could erase. The bobby pin was a victory, but a small one. It placed Alani in the woods, but it didn't prove she was dead, nor did it implicate Marcus. For Alani and Amani, hiding out in Decatur, the news of the discovery was a double-edged sword. It meant Harding was on the right track, but it also meant the clock was ticking. They needed their own smoking gun, and they needed it now. It was time to cast their invisible net. "He's paranoid now," Imani said, pacing her small living room. "Harding's visit with the K9 unit will have him spooked. He's going to make a mistake." They put their plan into motion. Using a new, untraceable burner phone, Imani typed out the simple, chilling message they had crafted. "The magnolias are wilting in the woods. Someone's been digging." She sent it to Marcus and immediately powered the phone down. Now, all they could do was wait and watch. The bait was set. They didn't have to wait long. From their remote access to Marcus's cloud backup, they watched his digital life in real time. Within minutes of receiving the text, his phone record showed a frantic 30-second call to Leo Simmons. It was followed by a flurry of texts, the content of which they couldn't see. But the activity itself was a confirmation. They had hit a nerve. The real prize, however, was the cloud backup. Alani had been right. Marcus, in his technological naivety, had his phone set to automatically back up everything, including a feature he'd enabled and forgotten about. Automatic call recording. It was a feature designed for business professionals to keep a record of conversations. For Marcus, it was about to become a digital confession booth. Alani's hands trembled as she typed in the password. Yo814 first date. A date that once symbolized love now felt like the key to a crypt. The cloud drive opened, revealing neatly organized folders. Photos, documents, contacts, and one labeled call recordings. Her breath caught in her throat. They clicked it open. It was a list of audio files, time-stamped and dated. They scrolled down, their hearts hammering, until they found it. A call placed from Marcus to Leo, dated the night Alani disappeared, timed just minutes after he would have returned home from the woods. Imani plugged her laptop into a small speaker, and they held their breath. She clicked play. The audio file crackled to life. First, the sound of a phone ringing, then Leo's voice, groggy and annoyed. "What? It's after midnight." Then came Marcus's voice. It was unrecognizable. All the smooth charm was gone, stripped away, leaving only the raw, ragged sound of pure panic. Leo, man, "We got a problem," he stammered, his breathing fast and shallow. "What problem?" Leo's voice sharpened with alarm. "Did someone see you?" No, not that. When I hit her, she went down. There was no pulse, Leo. I swear I checked. I thought she was gone." A choked sob. "But in the car, on the way out to the swamp, I thought I heard something. A sound. From the box." A cold silence hung on the line for a moment. Then Leo's voice, hard as steel. "What kind of sound?" "A cough," Marcus whispered, the word barely audible. "Or maybe a gasp. I don't know. I told myself I was imagining it. But what if I wasn't? What if she was still? What if we buried her?" "Shut up!" Leo hissed, his voice a blade. "Don't you dare say it. Don't even think it. It's done. You were spooked, that's all. She's dead. The box is cheap, but it's sealed. The ground is heavy. There is no way, I mean 0 way, she could get out. You hear me? It's over. She's gone. That bitch won't ever speak again. Now pull yourself together, get some sleep, and delete this call." The recording ended. The room was silent, save for the hum of the laptop. Alani and Imani just stared at each other, the horrifying words hanging in the air between them. They had it. The confession, the conspiracy, the cold-blooded confirmation of what he'd done, and the chilling admission that he knew she might have been alive. It was irrefutable. It was their smoking gun, their atomic bomb. Imani saved the audio file to a secure, encrypted thumb drive. "This is it, Alani," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the gravity of their discovery. "This is the nail for his coffin." Alani looked at the screen, at the name of the man she once loved, now just a name on a list of audio files. The invisible net they had cast had done more than just catch a fish. It had dragged a monster from the depths. He thought he had buried her secret in the ground. He had no idea he was carrying it in his pocket the entire time. The 7th day. A week to the hour since they had shoveled the last of the red clay onto her makeshift grave. In many traditions, 7 is a number of completion, of perfection, of divine rest. For Alani, it was the number of resurrection. Marcus Thorne felt on top of the world. The scare with the anonymous text had faded. The cop, Harding, hadn't been back. He and Leo had driven out to the site, from a safe distance, and seen no police tape, no signs of an active investigation. They had gotten away with it. The weight of his crime was being replaced by the intoxicating lightness of freedom and the prospect of a lot more money. To celebrate, they were having a small get-together at Marcus's apartment. Just a few friends, some bourbon, and loud music to drown out any lingering guilt. Leo was there, relaxed and expansive, telling a joke to a couple of Marcus's buddies from the dealership. The air was thick with cheap whiskey and denial. That's when the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Marcus called out, grabbing a beer from the fridge. He was expecting another friend, maybe a pizza delivery. He swung the door open, a lazy, welcoming smile on his face. The smile dissolved. It didn't just fade, it shattered, disintegrating into a mask of slack-jawed, primal horror. The bottle of beer slipped from his nerveless fingers and exploded on the welcome mat. Standing on his doorstep was a ghost. It was Alani, but not the Alani he knew. The long, soft hair was gone, replaced by a short, severe cut that exposed the faint, silvery trace of a scar on her temple. Her eyes, once warm and loving, were now as cold and hard as river stones. She was thinner, harder, a specter returned from the earth he had put her in. "Hello, honey," she said, her voice calm and level, a sound that was infinitely more terrifying than a scream. "Did you miss me?" Marcus stumbled backward, his legs turning to water. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. His mind simply refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Alani stepped over the threshold, her presence sucking all the air and noise out of the apartment. The music faltered. The laughter died. All heads turned to the doorway. Leo Simmons froze mid-sip, the bourbon glass trembling in his hand, his face a canvas of disbelief and pure terror. "What's the matter?" Alani asked, her gaze sweeping the room, landing on Leo. "You all look like you've seen a ghost." "No," Marcus finally wheezed, shaking his head, one hand coming up as if to ward off an evil spirit. "No, you can't be. You're dead. We buried you." The admission hung in the suddenly silent room, stark and absolute. His friends stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. One of the girlfriends quietly grabbed her purse and slipped out the door. The others began to back away, wanting no part of whatever madness this was. "You buried me," Alani repeated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. She took a slow step towards him. "But you didn't do a very good job. The box was cheap, Marcus, and the ground was soft." That's when Leo snapped out of his stupor. Fear was replaced by a feral instinct for self-preservation. "Finish it," he snarled at Marcus, his eyes wild. "We have to finish it now. She'll tell them everything." Leo lunged forward, his hands reaching for Alani's throat. But Alani was ready. This time, she wasn't a victim. She didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her phone, the screen already lit. "Tell them what, Leo?" she said, her voice ringing with clarity as she hit the record button. "That you masterminded a plan to steal fentanyl from a hospital? Or that when I found out, Marcus here cracked my skull on the countertop, and the two of you buried me alive because you thought I was dead?" "Shut up, you bitch!" Marcus screamed, his terror finally boiling over into rage. "You were supposed to stay gone. You've ruined everything." "Ruined what exactly?" Alani pressed, her phone held steady, a digital witness to his unraveling. "Your little side business, or just your life?" "Everything," he confessed in a torrent of panicked words. "The money, the connections, it was all working. And you had to go and be a hero. You were going to go to the police. You left me no choice." Just as Leo made another move towards the door, it swung open with a force that sent it crashing against the wall. Detective Frank Harding stood on the threshold, his service weapon drawn and held steady. Behind him, a team of uniformed officers fanned out, their faces grim. And just behind Harding's shoulder, Alani could see Imani, her face pale but her eyes blazing with triumph. "Marcus Thorne, Leo Simmons," Harding's voice boomed, cutting through the chaos. "You are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and trafficking of a controlled substance. You have the right to remain silent." Leo collapsed to his knees as if his strings had been cut, his face in his hands. But Marcus just stared at Alani, his eyes wide with a single, unanswerable question. "How?" he whispered as the cold steel of handcuffs closed around his wrists. "How did you survive?" Alani looked at the man who had tried to erase her, her expression unreadable. "You buried a nurse," she said, her voice low and steady. "You should have known I understand the importance of a second opinion." The courtroom was cold and impersonal, a stark contrast to the humid Georgia heat outside. But for Alani, it was the final stage of her transformation. She sat in the witness box, not as a victim recounting a trauma, but as an architect of justice, laying down each piece of evidence with calm, unshakable precision. The bobby pin, the meticulous spreadsheet of stolen drugs, the shell company records. And finally, the audio recording, the digital ghost of Marcus's confession, which played out in the dead silent courtroom, sealing his and Leo's fate. Marcus wouldn't look at her. He sat beside his lawyer, a shrunken, hollowed-out version of the charming man he once was. Leo just stared blankly ahead, his arrogance long since shattered. There was no defense against the truth she had so painstakingly assembled. The jury's guilty verdict was swift and unanimous. They were sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 30 years, a lifetime they had tried to steal from her. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. Nightmares still dragged her back to the suffocating darkness of the box. The phantom smell of damp earth would sometimes catch her off guard. The world, she found, was divided into two kinds of people: those who had never been buried alive, and her. She knew she couldn't stay in Augusta. The city was haunted by the ghosts of who she had been, and what had been done to her. Every street corner, every magnolia tree was a reminder. "What will you do now?" Detective Harding asked her, meeting her for coffee a week after the sentencing. He looked less tired than he had in months, a weight lifted from his own shoulders. "I'm moving," Alani said, stirring her latte. "And I'm changing careers." She had spent weeks thinking about it. Going back to nursing felt impossible. The sterile hospital corridors, the very drugs that had been the catalyst for her ordeal, it was all too much. But her experience had ignited a different fire within her. "I'm going to law school," she announced. "Imani's helping me with my applications." Harding smiled, a genuine rare thing. "The world has enough nurses. It could use a few more fighters like you on the right side of the law." Her journey had taught her a brutal lesson. The system was flawed, indifferent, and often blind. Justice wasn't a guarantee, it was a fight. She had been lucky to have the skills, the resources, and the ally in Imani to fight for herself. But what about the others? The ones whose cases were dismissed, whose truths were disbelieved, whose files were buried in a cabinet. She wanted to be their voice. The day she left Augusta, Imani drove her to the bus station. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. They had forged a bond in those 7 days that transcended words. "You're sure about this?" Imani asked, hugging her tight. "I've never been more sure of anything," Alani replied, her voice steady. "That girl, the one who fell in love with Marcus Thorne, she died in those woods. I'm someone else now." As the bus pulled away from the station, Alani looked out the window at the receding skyline of Augusta. She wasn't running away from a memory. She was driving toward a new purpose. She had faced the absolute worst of humanity, and had not only survived, but had emerged stronger, forged in the earth and darkness. The lesson she carried with her was a profound one, etched into her very soul. Survival is not merely the act of breathing when you are meant to be dead. It is the act of seizing control of your own story, of refusing to be defined by the grave someone else dug for you. It is the conscious, deliberate, and powerful choice to climb out of the darkness, stand in the sun, and use your voice not just to speak your own truth, but to fight for the truths of others who have been silenced. She was a survivor, and her real work was just beginning.